Tonight, we'll discuss the nature of painting, how that might have something to do with language, how language might have something to do with paint, how they fluidly kind of exchange ideas, interests, and suggestions. We are all gathered, and I will introduce in a minute each of our panelists and guest speakers. All have, in discussions, shared interests, things that cross over, things that have really caught these guys' attention over a number of years, perhaps decades. I will be asking questions from my phone because it's the 21st century, and I think that's allowed these days. So some short intros to our panelists. Robert, there we go, that's good, put your hand up. Robert Macfarlane is the author of books about nature, place, language, and people, including Underland, Landmarks, The Old Ways, and Mountains of the Mind. His work has won prizes around the world, been widely adapted for music, film, television, radio, and theatre, and he has also written films including River and Mountain, both narrated by Willem Dafoe. He has collaborated with artists including Olafur Eliasson and Stanley Donwood, and with the artist Jackie Morris, he co-created the best-selling books of illustrated poetry, The Lost Words and The Lost Spells. He has worked on songs and albums with musicians including Cosmo Sheldrake, Karine Polwart, and Johnny Flynn, with whom he released an album, Lost in the Cedar Wood, in 2021. He is a Fellow of Emmanuel College, University of Cambridge. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you.
Max, to my left, Max Porter, the author of 4 novels, and his work has been translated into 31 languages. His first novel, Grief is the Thing with Feathers, won the Sunday Times Peters, Fraser and Dunlop Young Writer of the Year, the International Dylan Thomas Prize, and the BAM Readers Award. His second novel, Lanny, was a Sunday Times top 10 bestseller, was longlisted for the 2019 Booker Prize, and shortlisted for both Waterstones and Foyle's Book of the Year 2019. His third book, The Death of Francis Bacon, was praised as a miniature masterpiece and a feat of empathy, imagination, and literary brio. His new novel, Shy, will be published in April 2023. Max frequently collaborates with artists, theatre makers, and musicians. Most recently, he wrote the short film All of This Unreal Time for the actor Cillian Murphy, and the pamphlet It's Going to Be a Bright New Day with Bonnie Prince Billy, which I didn't know about, which is amazing. There's a lot of music in tonight, so if you're music lovers, that will be very much part of the discussion. And finally, but not least, Nigel Cooke is known for his paintings that merge figurative forms with abstract and elemental atmospherics, informed by a range of fields from paleontology, neuroscience, classical mythology, and zoology. The linear construction of Cooke's paintings simultaneously recall brain circuitry, the human or animal body, and landscape formations. Using notational sketches and paintings made on location at various sites around the world, the artist distills his impressions of specific places and the people in them into a personal vocabulary of forms that evolve and repeat through time, with autobiographical material often infusing and directing the process. Developing an emotive and highly focused use of colour alongside these forms, Cooke's calligraphic images are delicately balanced, with structure and collapse held together in a state of tension. In their unfixed and writhing ambiguity, the works engage with the self as a porous system, in flux between animal states and prehistory, between one's inner life and the ecosystems of the world at large. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Nigel. Max, Robert. That was a lot to get into. As we sat amongst these paintings, and I just show here Atlas with Butterfly, I'm reminded of this new body of work has engaged with travel, adventure, Greek mythology, and delicate systems that govern the natural world. And we're here tonight to see how these things kind of intermingle, to see if there's any crossovers between our different practices. I guess I should introduce myself as well. Who am I? I'm Mark Beasley, and I run the curatorial directorial program for Pace Live, which has been running for about 3 years now. It's a number of panel discussions or largely live performances. And each event is kind of geared towards one of our roster artists, as Nigel is. And we kind of expand upon, think through, investigate the work in question. So tonight, it's Nigel and painting. But my first question is perhaps, it's geared to everyone, really. It's a question of language in relation to paint. There's something interesting, maybe revealing in all of your processes. You're arriving at both word, syntax, paint, and brushstroke, and often one releasing or making possible the other. For example, after completing a series of paintings, I believe, Nigel, you then write a short piece of prose or poetry. I know there's a text attached to this exhibition that you can find on the website, and often it's a way of you kind of breaking that spell of the work, coming out of it, and through language kind of discovering what has happened in that space in the studio over a matter of time. Clearly, Robert and Max reference visual art. At the start of Robert's book, Underland, I believe there's that beautiful image of the handprint from 35,000 years ago and the blown red chalk dust. So it begins with this kind of imprint, this first moment, the hand writing symbol, the body. And Max, obviously, in your latest book, The Death of Francis Bacon, it's an imagining of your relationship to Bacon, over time, which I highly recommend everybody read. I'm sure you have. First for our writers, do either of you paint and draw? Is that part of your process at all? I'm cheating. I know Max does. Yeah,
whether it's part of my process, I can't really say, but I do. I do paint and I do draw, and I would say that it is a relatively generative thing for me in terms of pushing against familiar or useless or exhausted moments in the writing process. If I draw or I stop, then I find that it lubricates the machine a little bit better. But also, we are all making choices. Representational choices or political choices. Every word is a political choice, and to stop and use a different set of tools, I think, refreshes those choices a little bit, or shines a different light on them. So I do make bad drawings and bad paintings, and it helps. Yeah,
often it does.
Also, I'm a collagist. I think both in my work and elsewhere, and to stop and think what my ingredients are, what I've gathered from the word hoard. To use is sometimes useful, and that I want the membrane between visual work, found materials, language work to be thin, if not non-existent.
So what are the images you make? What do they look like?
Just pornography. No, just reams of pornography. I draw. I'm quite diagrammatic. I would, for example, the Bacon book, I would draw a figure in space. I would borrow Bacon's relatively simplistic stickers, his toolkit. So half a sofa, a frame, a perspex box, a light switch. Draw those things, play with them, think about how to pin the figure into those sorts of artificial spaces. So just play, really. Just so simple diagrammatic.
Like quotations almost. Yeah. I think that's a bit what the writing is like for me. I'm not a writer, but I sort of pretend. It allows me to pretend to be one, and then it lets my brain free from this, which is more of a natural state where the thoughts are more kind of irregular and incomplete. So it's sort of, I often read something and say, well, I'll just ape that language for a minute, and then before I know it, I'm thinking differently and I can say something. But I find that with this, it's very hard to say anything about it when I'm making it. It's only, I have to sort of, in a way, adopt a different personality to even say anything at all. But I think early on, I found it much easier to talk about, and later on, almost impossible. And I think that's quite strange too.
Does what you write have? I mean, is it related at all, or is it decompression? I mean, are you writing about something completely other, just free-forming?
Yeah, I find I can't really write about painting at all. I just sort of go around it with something else. So it becomes, you know, like it's something usually been quite banal. Like, you know, with this one, it was this pelican landing in the sea. It's something that's not particularly meaningful, but there's usually a point where something sets me off thinking that paintings can be done. And I don't know if you're like this with your work, but as soon as you close one thing, you can't believe you'll ever do another. Maybe you're not like that, but I just don't know how I do it. So when I go back in, I need to find a way of saying, this is possible. And it's usually something from the outside world that's quite small and seemingly insignificant.
The pelican in this case. What happened?
Well, it just sort of, I was just staring like, what it is I was just painting the colours. I was trying to record the colours in it with watercolour, which actually appear in that painting there, which is the turquoises and pinks and purples. It's quite basic, but it just seemed incredibly otherworldly at a certain moment of the evening. And then this thing sort of just dropped, and I realized it made me think about the limit of my sight. It made me think about what it was I was looking at, what I was trying to apprehend, and why I was staring at the colours was sort of based upon something that painting wasn't interested in. It was something banal that was nothing to do with my work. It was when the thing landed, and there's injection of something ineffable and broader in terms of its relationship to pre-human time, and, you know, creatures that live just on the fringes of our awareness. It made me think much more about what this feels like to do than the colours did. So there's a tension there about what I assumed I was doing and where I was in relation to it and when I was in relation to it. So it was all captured in this one little bird splashing into the sea.
And that feels more generative to you than having to explain how you do the work and how you make the work, and anything more illustrative like that. That feels like more beneficial to you.
It does. That gets it, because there's a mystique. And I find it's harder to find that mystique, that thing that says something in this natural experience is what painting is. And that's the thing I can't explain. That's why I do the painting. The bit I can explain, that can come after. That's perhaps a bit more sort of, you know, buoyant. But the thing that's really happening is, again, it's in metaphor or something. It's not in what I can say.
Can we put the same question to Rob, like in terms of an encounter in the natural, you know, as a sort of animist proposition connected to the work that you do, an encounter with a living thing, probably non-human? Is that a necessary encounter for you in order to recharge the analysis that you do in an academic or a creative context elsewhere?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was thinking about mark making and line following, and I think you asked, you know, do you do anything with your hands? And the answer is no, I can't. I'm a terrible painter. I mean, absolutely mustn't be let anywhere near any plain sheet of paper or canvas. But I walk, and walking is a form of mark making. So it's a harrowing, and there are all sorts of etymologies that connect the act of inscribing a line and walking, and sometimes that line is divagatory and complex, and if you plotted it on a GPS, it might look a little bit like these, and sometimes the walker's feet are stitching things together, and sometimes they're perforating things, areas ready to tear. I've just come back from the Lake District. That's why I'm dressed in coal-covered jeans. And anyway, I would have made a bit more of an effort if I'd had a bit more time, but I came off the road about 7 minutes to 6. And the other thing that I do, because I'm telling stories as they unfold in time and space, as we all are, is that you look for the line. Climbers talk about a line. A climbing line is a line that isn't necessarily the most direct, the most pragmatic. It has a It has an elegance to it often. It balances forces of sort of strenuosity and responds to the form of the face itself or the mountain itself. So often the direttissimo, the tiger line, will not be the most beautiful line. And so finding the line that joins fragments, entities, visions, that then becomes the means of telling. And the path is our oldest story.
Over time, as both a walker and a painter, would you say that intuition plays a greater part in it? So finding your way across a mountain blindfold, or finding your way into a painting with a sort of second sight that you developed over time becomes closer.
For me, definitely. I mean, in a way, it took me a long time to learn the notional idea of the line and the capacity for it to be quite democratic. You know, you can say, you know, one person can say it's the top of the person's head, that's hair falling. Another person can say it's this. But if you paint it as though it isn't that, then you can imbue it with as much body as the other thing, but you've just got less verbiage around it. And it was that verbiage, I would call it, that was so was non-painting. It was sort of imported. It felt like a pollution in some way.
I feel exactly the same about expositional work in a social realist register in fiction.
Right.
Like, cut it out. All this bollocks.
I couldn't agree more.
But that's getting in the way of what I'm trying to do. So, like, a bit like why would I do the drawing is to work out what I need to smear if I'm trying to smear language, or what if hacking away at cliches or pre-existing formulations about grief or English mythology or whatever, cutting out this verbiage in order to get at what generates, what has some friction, or where the line is or ends, or.
Virginia, I wondered with Robert.
Hang on, he's about to say something about Virginia Woolf.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, there's a great line Virginia Woolf says somewhere.
Oh, he is? Oh my God.
I can smell it on him.
She says the hardest thing in writing is getting a character from one room to another. And I think there's so much in that, and it comes down to what Max was talking about, smudging from one place to another. And one can sit and stare at that problem, how to get a character from one place to another, and it becomes the most deathly process. And then actually finding a way that they might walk through a wall, vanish underground, and reapparate next door. Anyway, so that I always think that's a good question to ask of when one is stuck, is how am I going to get a character from one room to another? Sorry, Mark.
No, so I was just thinking about, and somebody I worked with once, are there any actions that you perform within the walking? I'm thinking of somebody like Richard Long. You're not that kind of demonstrative.
Well, I once walked to a meeting to meet Richard Long, who I'm sure everyone here knows. That he once walked 33 miles a day for 33 days. He's the nailist walker that I know. And I thought I can't get a cab to see Richard Long, so I walked from central London or something up to Hampstead Heath Road, and I pulled a muscle on the way. It was just so embarrassing. So we couldn't even go out for a walk together. But I picked things up. I suppose that's like Nabokov has that line about making his work from pebbles and fluff as he gathers and then doesn't realise they become a nest or something like that. And that was happening when we were in the lakes these winter days just gone. I suddenly realised that what was joining everything that we were doing was the blade. It was the blade of the greenstone axes that were quarried for 1,000 years in a Neolithic axe factory. But it was also the way that the blade of a ridge at a much greater scale was sharp enough to cut light. It was a subtle knife. It was splitting season off into season, and it was snow off from grass and light from shadow, and it was also cutting time. So then that's another form of line, and it comes from picking up fragments which you then realise are coordinates.
But you've also, in that one phrase, there's a incredible poetic description of one thing, but it captures so many layers, like strata of experience, doesn't it? Like it's what you just said.
Right.
You know, so the line, although it's one thing, it's giving you the opportunity to sort of talk about human history and perception and nature and everything all around that one, because of its sort of unequivocal sort of singularity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing that I think I look for myself with this. It's like you're looking for something that allows that layering on of something that is not. That is like looking at nature. It's not a crappy copy of it, but it's like layering on of nature itself.
That's why I was saying to you before about this new work seeming to me so for want of a better word, hard. The engagement with painting is so hard. The philosophical potential embedded in them is so hard. But also, it seems to me that what you're asking of the brush and the range of the brush as a cut, as the end of a mark, as the beginning of a mark, as the erasure of a mark, as light coming in, it seems to be like the full apparatus of painting. You know, however many thousands of years human beings are doing it, at the tip of one hand, is quite an intense encounter for you with these paintings, right?
Well, I mean, if that's how you see it, that's like my absolute dream. Because that's, you know, in a way, I'm trying to make a classical painting, but with none of the things in it, just the energy and the relational aspects of how things are articulated. Like, you know, the subtle modulations between space and thing, texture and movement, and all of these dynamics, the dynamics of classical painting. But then in the last minute, pull the image out and put another one in, which is based on a kind of a fucked up relationship between memories, things seen, things remembered, books read, the things you said at the top, Mark. Right. And put those things in instead, like a little kind of cocktail of contemporary rubbish. Which is a way of describing my own head, and just see if they talk and see if they actually kind of if they can make a painting possible.
Now that you've abstracted them into these tangled lines, more than, you know, there are no longer any beautiful modernist, you know, any kind of brutalist buildings. There's no bearded guys raving or smoking fags or vomiting anymore in your paintings. But are they, in a non-illustrative sense, are they there? Are they still in there for you?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Have you just raised you've just raised the stakes?
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, the Apollonian side of it has always got to be destroyed by the Dionysian side of it, I think, in my head. And I think in the past there was essentially a kind of vagabondish painter let loose within the scenes, who was an alter ego and could get up to things. But now it's more, again, like the other thing you were saying, it's more compressed into the touch. So there's a way in which, if you can paint and draw, it becomes a kind of curse, because you sort of sterilize everything. It becomes this sort of anodyne grace that that has no edge, that has no kind of tensions. So, lived experience isn't that. So you have to kind of learn that as well. You have to learn its opposite in a convincing way, instead of just like cutting holes in it or chucking, you know, whatever at it. You've got to learn a different voice at the same time. And I think all of my work has been about that duality between the Apollonian achievement and the Dionysian destruction. And how do they become something that feels like life or experience and actual.
Can I ask a question about names in relation to that? So they're not on the wall, but as you will know, this really struck my eye as a very bad natural historian but a bit of a kind of taxonomist or taxonophile. I'm interested in, obviously, as we all are, in how we categorize things. But so each painting has a name. So, for example, this is our osprey, isn't it?
No, this is the Pandion. Yeah.
This is the osprey. So Pandion is the name.
Yeah.
And that takes us to osprey, the fish-eating raptor.
Yeah.
And for me, when then each of the paintings has its kind of sort of nomic taxonomic, as it were. That riddles you in, but doesn't solve and doesn't pin. And for me, the experience of watching birds is this. It's incredibly dynamic. It elapses in time. Some of you may know Xavier Bou's photography, where he slows down the wing beats of a murmuration of starlings or ravens in their roosting flight, and suddenly you begin to see the traces that they leave within the sky, and there's something of that, but much that's different going on here as well. So can you just tell us why you've named them as certain? Does each of them have a moment in an encounter with an osprey? Or
it's odd, because you know that thing you're saying about the flight. I mean, obviously they said the thing about the pelican earlier, but after that, once I noticed that, it's odd. It's like I think it was Agnes Martin that said, I mean, you'll probably know more about this, Mark, as an in-house sort of a quote, but it's something like, painting's about whatever comes into your head, and if Picasso comes into your head, then you're fucked. And it's like, once I decided I was thinking about pelicans, then whatever I thought about, they sort of became embodied, and then the names were just a way of trying to sort of refract without it being a literal naming device, but something was a little bit more obscure that would sort of, if you wanted to, or if you had the kind of experience to relate it, you might get there. But it's almost literally what they said back to me, what kind of animal was being evoked somehow in my life with the thing as I was making it. And it's sometimes to do with symmetry and, sense of predation. I mean, it's odd that, the thing about line when you're making an image, and if, you're describing a leaf that becomes a wave and becomes an eye and then becomes a wing or something, you're in this conversation with natural things, because otherwise, if you make abstract paintings, like deliberately, I always felt that you were just like playing with your food a little bit, like it's just pushing crap around the surface. But if you say, I have to say it's something, like even at the most rudimentary level, then I find it fascinating that you still make an image. And even if it's just a name, is all you've got, and you say it's an osprey, it's a sea hawk or something, or swan, or tiger, panther, or whatever the other ones are, why does it become an image? And that's the thing that fascinates me, because you can't not, I can't not somehow, and that's kind of what that's about.
Okay. Referring to Agnes Martin, I wanted to push us on to another one of the senses that is present in your works, perhaps, but not immediately evident, which is music. And Agnes Martin's one of my favourite quotes from her is, the greatest form of abstraction is music. She always wanted her paintings to reach...
She said speed garage, didn't she, Mark?
She did. Drum and bass. Drum and bass. That was grind.
Disrespectful to Agnes Martin to make that joke. Sorry, Karine.
It's good. She was, a real kind of music person, and she wanted painting to achieve the state of music. And I know with each of you in different ways. I know, I recently read Lanny, and you can't help but hear that kind of rhyming. There is a bit of speed garage in Lanny, in points. Like the characters operate or have different sensibilities, like different kind of points of departure in relation to their, the way that they kind of scat or don't, or dead papa toothwort, I think it's the name. Am I getting that wrong? But that kind of, that concrete poetry and that flow on the page, that literal kind of movement of words. And I know, Nigel, when we've talked about your painting over time, and music's been very key, from listening to Sono to musicians for this series that you mentioned, Niels Fram. And then with Robert, I mean, you've also collaborated with musicians. And I wonder what the draw is with that. I don't want to take us too much out of the painting, but maybe, Nigel, you can talk to that. What is music your companion in the studio, or
well, a bit, but I think I shouldn't make that more about me, because we've all. Well, I think what we found is that we have a similar. I think we've created this playlist thing. We've created this amazing folding in of similar ideas, which is quite uncanny. I think my daughter heard me playing it. She was like, "God, you found some people that like the same crap that you do." But it's like, in the studio, there's definitely a sort of a minimal and atmospheric sense of nature. That's what I'm sort of looking for. Something that is just is it music? I don't know. Like it's sound, and but it's completely stripped to some sort of emanation, I suppose. I kind of don't want to kind of hog that, but when I make these, I sort of begin with an emanation, which is the thing in the background. Like it's just something drawing you forward from a long way away, like a sort of smear, a stain of just colours. and the music is almost at the same level. It's like if it's on or sometimes I can't tell whether it's switched on or it's switched off. There's atmospherics of the studio are almost the same as some of the music, and I want that kind of unbroken inner and outer thing, because I think for me, all my work is about the tension between your interior life and the world at large, and that it's a big subject, but music is the thing that really gets that conversation started for me.
Yeah.
In the studio.
And Nigel's referring to when we all jumped on Zoom together for the first time, we realized the crossover in music, and we produced a Spotify, well, these guys did, a Spotify list that we titled Bone Music. And I wonder, Robert, if you could talk about and I didn't realize, the first musical instrument that was taken literally from the carcass of a bird. Or
It's this, some of you will know it, perhaps this instrument in particular, but so one of the earliest musical instruments, dated fairly reliably to about 35,000 years ago, is a bone flute, and it was carved hollowed out from the radius bone of a griffon vulture, big wingspan raptor. It was found in a limestone cave in the Jura not so long ago, and when it was being played, ice ruled Europe. This was deep in the glaciation, the last glaciation of the Pleistocene, and almost certainly played in that cave, almost certainly where fire was, and beyond that cave was cold and darkness, and yet music was made there, and notes flew, and sparks flew, and it's been reconstructed and played, so you can, you can't, of course, reverse engineer the melodies, the tunes that were being played, but we can hear what individual notes sound like. And that ancient connection between flight, feather, bird, song is the lyric which is airborne, which is set flying, is there in the technology. So we decided we would title the playlist Bone Music, and the first inclusion on it was the playing of the bone flute, a modern playing of the bone flute. So and then Max, who I think confessed to listening to, was it 7 million hours of Spotify last year? Wow. It clearly works. Whatever.
I can stretch time. Yeah.
That's amazing.
When ambient drone is my friend, I can stretch time. Yeah.
And you filled
we added things. Yeah, I mean, for me, the exciting thing is that the charge differences between these art forms, the speed it takes to imbibe them, and the different ways in which the work itself can push against the delivery mechanisms and the institutional frameworks that surround it. So, how to be a painting outside a frame or a piece of glass or a gallery? What is it still a painting? And these sorts of questions. But for me, working with musicians and writing with music, it takes me to a place a little bit closer to painting, I would have thought, in terms of the decisions being made and the distance one needs from the work and the desire to engage with the materials and think about the bodily relationships in place. So there is nothing more. I'm very into these into sounding the note. What is it to sound the note, and to what extent is that a collaborative undertaking between the bone flute and the person listening to it, or to what extent can it be tricked or restaged or unpacked in the forms you choose, be it a hybrid form or an archaeological, a reenactment or whatever it is. They feel like painterly questions for me, especially for someone so concerned with the history of the image up until this point, in a time, as you've written about so eloquently, in after the death of painting. How does one reinstate how does one sound out painting?
Yeah.
How, Nigel? How?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's like the Agnes Martin thing. I think in the end you get to a point where you know that painting is just rhythms, really. Like it's not a picture. And the picture's the sort of the I don't know, the carrot.
Yeah.
And actually there's something else underneath that. I mean, this is obviously only knowable really in this era of time without the as you say, the institutional frameworks that made paintings possible in different blocks of time in the past. There's obviously, and even the hand on the cave, I suppose there's an absolute painting in that to do with assertion of self, destruction, and progress all happening together in one gesture. And I suppose it's taken a long time for that to sort of come back around. And
can I ask you about sort of apocalyptic modernism then? Because I think Rob and I, one thing we really have in common is I mean, Rob, you've.
I'm waiting for you to finish the sentence.
Well, growing up the fear of nuclear bombs.
Right, thank you.
Fear of nuclear apocalypse.
When the wind blows.
Where the wind blows, and to me, Rob's reached this sort of climactic moment across all his books, which is the mass, which is the mass of nuclear waste, but also ness, and how can you translate or transform that into a potentially beautiful, hopeful thing, whether or are we doomed? Is it Anthropocene pessimism in its apogee? Is it the death of the species and the death of thought and the death of the line? But as a painter, because we come from as a literary tradition, and Rob and I think we work quite hard in our very, very massively different ways, but to try and flood the project back with a sort of post-apocalyptic romance or empathy or hope or any of the things we try, collaborative projects. But in painting, the starkness of that which we can never write poetry again after point X is a harder proposition, isn't it, with painting in the digital age?
Why do you think?
Maybe it's what I say, because there seems to be a sort of philosophical, a sort of nihilistic expanse to the challenges of painting that isn't there in language, because there's so much to hack through. A bit like the speed of imbibing again. Painting has to be right there, whereas the immediacy of music or the kind of mannerisms of literature, they're so coded in the language, but that is closer to the bone flute for me personally, because there's so much less signifier and there's so much less socio-political freight to it. I mean, for me to even start writing a book and put it out there is already so freighted with gender politics or who gets to speak or what language am I speaking or has it already been translated. Whereas that is gesture on canvas. That is paint being stuck on canvas.
Yeah, it's funny that, isn't it? Like, definitely all that material, and sort of I sometimes wish that I could have all that material and it to work, like to be able to make a book and it, talk in all these different voices and levels. But I think it's a disaster in painting. I think the bone flute is the future of painting.
Yeah.
Because I think it's sort of, I think what it does, it's a strange take on modernism in a way, that maybe there is an essence to it in my mind. Maybe there is. It's not a form of communication where you can say, I'm going to paint a picture about these people doing this, or this animal doing that in this place, or all of these things, because there's better ways of doing that. I think your mediums, I mean, both your work, I've read several books by both, and there's no way I'd ever dare to write a book after reading those, but it's more that you realize that painting is not about that. It's about the texture of the thing underneath those ideas. It's the thing. It is the bone and the rock and the strata that makes an image sort of sit up and become physical, I think. And I think the other stuff is extraneous, and it'll sort of, it's better done in another way.
Well, when they gathered the people, Rob, you need to talk about this because I'm actually badly paraphrasing you, but when they gathered the people to think about how they might convey to people in 100,000 years' time, don't go in this room, it's full of nuclear waste. In that consortium of minds, they had got painters and sculptors.
The field of nuclear semiotics. So if you're burying a material that will still be dangerous, let's say in 50,000 years, let's say in 10,000 years, that's far longer than any structure has survived. It's certainly far longer than a language has survived. In ways that are kind of that communicate across deep human time to come, deep human future time, and so the Americans created this field. Anyway, I was about generally. They gathered what they called rather kind of. Anyway, I was about to generalize about Americans. Anyway, they called it the the atomic priesthood, and they brought in They realised they needed the physicists there, they needed the engineers there, they needed the people who could think structurally about this problem, but they also realised from the beginning, and I think admirably, that they needed science fiction novelists, they needed artists, they needed linguists, they needed anthropologists, and in the end, I think it was an anthropologist, linguist called Thomas Semiotic, who decided that the idea of a story passed down through time, which admitted the possibility of its mutations and recognized that the possibility of a transcendental signifier moving across 5, 10, 15, 20,000 years was an impossible dream. So what you need is something that mutates as it moves, but carries. They also notoriously, there was some discussion over whether Munch's The Scream would be the ideal transcendental signifier. Just put that on the tomb door where you've buried.
And it's already fridge magneted, so you just whack it on there.
But then it's like, maybe it's the old conversation about The Scream. Actually, is he having a great time? I mean, come on in. So yes, but this is interesting about what your form is doing that no other form can, and then how that moves across time.
And I suppose it's, my early art education, formalism in terms of art was like the worst thing. It was like the dead interwar kind of nonsense that, particularly in Britain, and we were all all the tutors and people we encountered at that time were like, this is, it's got to be about something. You can't just, the materials aren't, important. But in a way, it's, I mean, like with your, like if you're looking at time, looking at rock or any of these, that you can look at the paint that your books kind of shatteringly do, that you can look at the paint that way as well. You can sort of say, well, what's in that? Even all the minerals and plant parts and all the things that sort of gather towards colour. The colour and the form of it. You're just sort of intervening in a sort of long chain of like, I don't know, the life of these atoms and particles and the rest of it. So you can really kind of drill into it wherever you want. Where you are in relation to its makeup is movable that way as well as across. And I think that was a bit of a liberation for me. So you can actually find formalism in the fact that it's kind of naturally occurring material.
Can I ask a question that runs the risk of being the question that always gets asked of writers? Well, there's where do you get your ideas from? Which, anyway, and then there's
I was going to get to that, Robert. What my last
saving the best for last, yeah. Or what pencils, pens / notebooks do you use? But I'm genuinely interested in the brushes. So I was at a painter studio, Julian Cooper, mountain painter, and all of his brushes were sort of 1.5 feet or longer. And he was fascinating on this. He said he wants the loss of control that brings. He also wants the kind of triple jointed extension that brings the act of painting back into the core, into the torso. And he kind of braces the tip of a long brush under here, holds it down there and through there. And that gives him, but he wanted to be out of control. And he said, I couldn't paint with the precisions of a small brush. So if that's not a really terrible question to ask an artist, can I ask about your brushes?
No, it's not terrible. In fact, it gets to the heart of the whole thing, because really, painting is manual thought. So you're trying to, and this is where the music comes in, because you're translating something which, like the blather of your mind, into something bodily. And there is a loss, something changes in that. And that's the thing you become fixated on, is what happens between the impulse to do it and then the electro, the physical and electrical things that happen to make your arm move. And the brush is the bit where it comes up against the real world. So everybody's got their own way of understanding what happens there. And I've always considered that to be a sort of a vocabulary plug-in is the brush. I always talk about the voice or something of a brush, like it's going to say this because it says the thing through the speed at which it's able to travel across the surface with the paint mix in a particular way at a particular time in the life of the painting. it'll say a different thing, and that's also contingent on the absorbency of the material at that point, how much other paint is on there. So there are all these sort of like micro calculations that you sort of make, and it all converges on this choice of a thing that's on the end of a stick, or some hairs and whatever else. And I've gone through the thing of like commissioning brushes this big, of using them like with magnifying glasses. I've done the whole thing because in a way it's all vocabulary. And you know, sometimes the best is when you say it's just got to come from B&Q, and it's just got to be cheap, and you know you can only have one, so just go and choose one and just use that. And it's a bit like you might say, you know, you're going to reduce, you know, your scope of a book to, like, you know, maybe Bacon on his deathbed, or maybe it's over millions of years of, you know what I mean. You've got to choose a battle, haven't you?
Yeah.
And sometimes the brush is a way of doing that.
Those paintings you did about 10 years ago, where you have you're using the big brush and you're doing the sort of squeegee thing over incredibly finished portraiture or architectural drawings. Did that begin as a destructive gesture, or was it a register thing? Did you need another pictorial device on top of what you were working on?
Well, both of they're kind of the same thing for me. Yeah. And it's about the idea that how do you create the tension that feels so awkward. It's like what it's like to live. You know, it's like to think and move about. And it starts off with usually a hunch. Like that was like get a decorator's brush, tie another one to it. What if we tie 3 together? And then what if we find someone that can make one 4 that wide? You know what I mean? It's often a dare element. Like how far can it go and still work? But then with those things, it's like, you know, how do you get it to talk back to the thing that you were trying to build all along? And usually there's an idea of nature. For those, it's the sea. You know, it's like that's what it makes sense to me, is understanding that as a waveform, with people appearing and emerging like as they would visually. There's always a kind of a literal thing at work, a little bit. Like how is it still a picture rather than just scrubbed away? How is it still kind of relatable?
And how is it still generating what it needs to do in both those, in both the smear and the detail? And
I tend to find it's in thinking about things at different scale registers. So is that people on an island like a mile out at sea? And I can see them and think about them, but I'm also in the water, so I'm aware of the sea here. How do you paint both those scale registers? And the brush is the way you sort of do that. It allows you to think through sort of aerial space with paint.
This is very close to the work of a writer. Rob, can I ask, because without any spoilers, but you're working on a book on rivers, that's public knowledge, isn't it? You know, it's a bit like Nigel saying that the grace of competent artistry is established and needs to be deconstructed or put aside in order to get where you want to get with the thing. You're an extraordinary prose stylist, that much is established. How do you keep that in play or get it out of the way in order to write a book that might be like a river? Is that a thing that you're concerned with?
Yes, very much so. I thought I wrote a book called Underland, which I think Nigel had read and was mentioned earlier by Mark, but I thought that I'm always inclined to load the rift with ore, as it were, linguistically, and kind of fill it full of riches. But and I thought when I went underground that darkness as a diminishment of sight, at least, would result in a corresponding kind of paring away of the linguistic register. Absolute opposite happened, complete explosion. It was because the haptic became really important and smell became really important. Then returning to the surface, the rebirth, where colour, I was underground for 3 days at one point and then came back up, and green was the greenest green I had ever met. It was absolutely astonishing again. So how to write like a river? I don't think I will write like a river, but I will write with rivers, and they will be in the acknowledgements to this book, as music has been, as writers, artists have been in the other ones. But this one really, really will be thought with those collaborators, citizens, beings that we live with, and that the subterranean suppressed streams of vitalism, animism, which have been absolutely mortified out of existence by the systems that have been constructed since around the 15th century to run the world, they are still resurging, and they do spring forth at sites, and there are places in the world where they never went underground.
I only ask because like just in when you talk, for example, to children about a thing such as a sacred site or animism or even faith, or even I would really suggest it's in the strongest possible terms something like painting, explaining abstraction to a child by looking or even standing in front of some ghastly fucking Renoir or something with a Renoir expert and knowing that after 45 minutes Renoir will start to give in a way it doesn't to a Philistine like me. That is a reinstatement of the seriousness of the form itself, of the inherent properties of the form itself, so be it a river or a painting, in a way that with language or with takes these undertakings with language or with the line.
But that's what your books sort of do anyway, isn't it? With the the mobile perspective. And the voice movements, and it's.
Well, like, what am I saying about grief? What am I saying about a teenager in 1995 who's obsessed with drum and bass? Like, and what are my tools for doing that? And are questions of faith and even spirituality and like deep seriousness compatible with such a project? Mm-hmm. Can you create something very, very beautiful out of something apparently mundane? And is that a reversal of capitalism's processes, or can it be done? Is that part of the post-bomb resignment, or is it part of something to do with reinstating and reanimating? I don't know.
There was some. I keep thinking, looking at these paintings, about the history of performance painting, action painting that maybe historically registered as Pollock, but was in the hand that you mentioned at the start of your book. And I keep going back to those painters, there's a Herman Nietzsche painting downstairs. His paintings came from the 6-day plays, from these weird mystery theatres where there were 100 actors or engaged fully in the production of these paintings, these abstractions. Another painter like Liu Fan, who in one brushstroke says everything. There's an action, there's this performance. Somebody like Pat Steer, who throws paint at a wall. I wondered if there was that. My sense is you're not fully there in the kind of wild abandon of, the bone flute, so to speak. But it feels like it's there. It feels like it's there, but we're reminded that there's a control, in a sense. And, I'm thinking of Max's use of, because I've just read Lanny, and it's really with me, that village, the Green Man, and performance. I'm a performance person. I wondered how you felt about that, and then I'm going to open it up very quickly to the audience and very cheekily ask one last question instead of opening it up. But maybe a quick response to that.
Yeah, I suppose the performance thing is that there's no real revision. It isn't the throwing it and that's the truth. It's not really about that. But they're made in a quite a linear way. So they start from a distant point and then they come forward. Right. And then however they end up, they're left. They don't really get scraped and edited out like that. They kind of like they sit. The only thing that really happens is that things that seem to be salient become emphasized with thicker paint or brighter paint. So there's an amplification and a nearing of image, but also of ending. The ending point of the painting gets nearer, closer, thicker, brighter, and it's done. Yeah. So it's linear in that sense. Whereas before you could say, "Oh, do it for a bit, let's scrape it off, paint that white, project that onto there, do this." It goes back and forth in time, and these don't do that. They kind of step forward and then stop, and then I have to decide whether I can live with that statement. So in my world, they are much closer to that, but they have a part of that, definitely.
Okay, let's open it up. I don't think we have a roving mic, so you'll have to project. Think of the theatre, darling. Gentleman at the back.
The idea of kind of geographic stuff and kind of psychogeographic stuff around the lines. I'm wondering if any of you have read Bruce Ketwin's Songlines, like the legacy of Indigenous Australian paths being passed down during generations, and how through the whisper they kind of become ambiguous and subjective, and how these moving from an objective image to a subjective image, does it kind of become more symbolic of a whisper or kind of a subtlety than a definitive image?
So that's a question for Rob Macfarlane, if ever I heard.
Well, I can deal with the first half a little. Yes, I've read the songlines. So it was published in 1988, as you all know, and that was the year after Chatwin died. Herzog got Chatwin's rucksack given to him on his deathbed as Chatwin choked to death on the Chinese bone fungus that was blooming in his mouth, which he refused to name as AIDS, which is what it was. And the songlines has a very, complex and contested history, and there's the decolonization of Bruce going and wandering around Australia with Salman Rushdie, who's not named as such in the book, which is sort of a novel but kind of not, and then taking this indigenous knowledge, this indigenous mapping, mnemonics as navigation, song, note. Each songline attaches notes to salient features in the landscape, and therefore, when you sing the song, you are singing a route that can be passed on. And so, it's a beautiful, beautiful idea. And I think that the book has been treated too harshly at times, and is actually sort of starting to curve back around and be seen as a more tender and respectful treatment of that knowledge than originally. But that notion that every step is a story and every path tells, or in this case sings, feels very familiar to me and not endemic to that culture either. Painting-wise, I hand over to the resident expert.
Well, I suppose the bit that you said about the whisper, you were asking if the final layer was more akin to a whisper, and it starts with more voluble and ending quieter somehow. I suppose that's true because there's a closing down of alternatives, and if you think about cacophony, it's all alternatives, and then eventually, if you hear an orchestra tuning up, there's that moment when it's all pinging off in every direction, and it just suddenly converges into a sort of singularity, and I think that's, I suppose whisper makes me think about volume, but it also the commitment to one note as a singularity is also how you describe a whisper, isn't it? And I think that would be true. It's about how options are closed down into something which becomes sort of restive and unequivocal, I suppose. So, in a kind of way.
Anyone else at the back?
Firstly, just want to say thank you, because that was such a generous and delicious conversation about being and finding a way and process. I actually just want to ask about abstraction and its connection to reality, because Rob, I think your books are so in this world. Max, maybe your books are of this world. I don't know what you think about yourself, but what
he's Lovecraft over there,
and how it might be connected to reality in some way for each of you.
Well, I won't answer it directly because it does seem like a thing that Nigel will speak really beautifully to. I would just say that my books seem to me, the more I think about them as... the Bacon book specifically was an attempt to get beyond an illustrative mode, which felt veiled really for me in anti-art history as a gesture. Just anti-visual analysis or the kind of biographical prison into which we lock artists, which I think is very unhealthy and often has very unhappy results. And I guess Lanny, I would say, is sort of anti-tabloid gesture. It's just to try and, it's sort of anti-propaganda. It's to sort of wake up the whisper, as it were, and see how communicative strategies have been so rich and so generous and so diverse. And history is such a lie, it's such an illusion, and such a dangerous and damaging and usually, in fact, genocidal force. So it's a sort of against the forces of supremacy in praise of the forces of gossip and chat and law and myth. So all I would say is that abstraction seems to me, the more I think about the illustrative prospect of naming, and the more the sort of drunk, my earliest forays into writing were based on Freud's idea of a wild analysis and writing about Paul McCarthy that I mentioned to you the other day, that you liberate the work to be a polluter, a generous and life-giving abstraction, just to bend away from authoritarian forces, I suppose, to bend away from control and into states of flow and flux and freedom and exchange. So to me, abstraction is the great promise of a more ambitious way of looking at the world and representational strategies, rather than a coercive and authoritative thing. That's a great, long, rambling mess of an answer, but Nigel's paintings are like, tangle it up, man. They're saying to me, tangle it. And the more one learns about the way the brain works and about the way one learns about mesh and entanglement in the natural world and fungal networks, which I'm really dangerously onto Rob's expert territory here, but the more one learns about how the world and the relationship between human and non-human things functions, the more one sees abstraction as a natural state that we might get back to in a reverential way, rather than an artificial thing related to so-called great works by men.
I think
I apologise for a messy answer. I'm just throwing old bits of burger into the pot.
No, it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's like, I think that's how I would relate to it as well. It's almost like you realise, I mean, dealing with the mesh or the matrix is a way of dealing with being human without being the freight of identity and singularity and bounded borders. You know, that idea that you are kind of connected with systems. And that's a kind of definition of abstraction that's beyond the sublime. It's beyond the kind of the politicized sublime of modernism. It's about how, you know, you can be, you know, you understand your sort of your codependency with systems at large, whether that's the ones inside you that make your thoughts happen, or, you know, the systems of the woodland and the world around us, and even just the particles that drop from deep space through our bodies every minute of the day. That in your book you've sort of describe a guy deep in the mind looking for the dark matter, and he understands walking along a cliff that he's just a network, and he knows this at like a profound level, that he is only a grid, really, in some ways. The things are dropping through him all the time.
But what really astonishes him, this is a dark matter physicist, is that he can hold the hand of the person he loves as he walks along a cliff and not fall through the cliff or pass through the person he loves. So the miracle there is touch, even despite the distances between not only us but within ourselves. And I would only add a word in praise of prepositions. It was you began by distinguishing between in and of, and perhaps then moving on to with. And I love prepositions. They're much passed over particles of speech, and in fact, when used rigidly, they sediment a grammar of division, and when used well, they advocate a grammar of animacy and help us to see the forms of entanglement that are so complex that we can barely begin to understand them. So yes, in praise of prepositions.
What he said.
Thank you. I don't know if you've got time for one last question, and as long as it's not, where do you get your ideas from?
Well, I was at an Australian festival, and a friend of mine called Jesse Ball, who's a wonderful writer, if any of you want to read a wonderful American writer, who's a monk-like figure, a lucid dreamer as well. A girl said, "Where do you get your ideas from?" And the person on the panel sneered. I went, "Oh," sort of apologised. And Jesse went, "No, that's an incredible question." It was a schoolgirl that asked it. And we did a kind of 35-minute, we listed everything. We really went into it. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
From Goldie to FX Twin. Yeah.
It was on it.
Okay, Alice, question. Thank you. Yes.
All right. Something just popped into my mind on the last answer. And it's really in relation to this, is that I was recently, a few years ago at CERN, looking at some of the maps of the atom smashing together. Now, for a physicist, they are absolute gold, and they're interpretive. They're representations, though, of what's happening. They're not actually what's happening. But to me, they were some of the nicest, most beautiful things I've ever seen. Now, the thing is that the question would be, do we need to have the knowledge to appreciate what's going on? Or is the mystery and is the unknowingness something which is actually more transcendental.
The big question of abstraction versus figuration. Go for it, Nigel.
I don't know. I mean, it depends what you. I suppose you could always say what depends what you mean by knowing. What the knowing is as well, isn't it? Like what do you know even when you do know? Like, there's no. If you respond to the thing, then.
Well, this is it, because when you actually look at what the map is now with all the particles,
I don't see what the cost would be of knowing.
Really, still very complicated.
Yeah.
Well, we were looking at Nigel's painting earlier, and I was suggesting a kind of how to be bothness that one can have in oneself, in one's viewing strategies or reading strategies or pedagogical techniques, an inbuilt awe, naivety, if you want, an unknowingness of what it means, and an ability to appreciate abstraction as a surface, as well as highly sophisticated understanding of what's happening, and one can train oneself in a completely bespoke way to be both. How to be childlike, how to be wise. Do you see what I mean? I think that's the challenge of the individual confrontation with any image. And good images take you further down that difficult and personal path. Bad ones stop you straight up. There's no entry point. If I'm being too optimistic then about the individual encounter with art.
I don't know.
But I was on the train to Paris today, and there were some English people sitting there, and they were saying how much they hated painting, and they tried, and they'd been to a Picasso exhibition, and they said, conned again. And my wife and I talked a lot about it, about why we found the great con of Picasso, and we talked a lot about why it would, how we found it upsetting, and then a bit funny, and then and then we were talking about like having religious encounters in front of Side Twombly, and like how much that would annoy these people. But I liked the challenge of one person's junk is another person's sacred object, and I want to keep having that conversation with myself when I encounter anything, and realizing that work, even being aware of the prepositions. Digging deep into the underland of everyday speech and stuff is hugely rewarding, not necessarily in the instant, but in the unknowable months and years to come.
Can I just throw one thought in? I'm sure. Your question put me in mind of a phrase that I heard in the dark matter laboratory a mile underground or thereabouts at Bulby in North Yorkshire, and the phrase is annihilation byproduct. And the dark matter physicists, they still don't have the technology to find the missing mass of the universe, the part of it that is represented by dark matter. So they have to hope that they will be witness to an encounter between an invisible dark matter particle, acronymized as a WIMP, weakly interacting massive particle, and part of the baryonic world that we're all made of and sitting on, and so they watch effectively for a ghost that can't be seen to strike the billiard ball of Newtonian physics, and then watch what happens to the billiard ball as it disobeys the obligations of Newtonian physics, and in the encounter, annihilation occurs, and the byproduct of the encounter is kinesis. And so what this perhaps becomes an over-elaborate grandiloquent metaphor for the difference between representation and abstraction, but it seems that that a lot of what abstract work is seeking is a way to get to the annihilation point, and it's also just so faithful. These physicists are so faithful, and the word mass, the Bulby Dark Matter Lab is not far from Revo Abbey. I went from one to the other, and it's just like, this is where mass is being held and has been for centuries in both of these ways. It's a beautiful, godly endeavor that was happening down there in the salt mine.
That's funny, because I was thinking when I walked in here this evening how if I'd been dragged through the Church of England rituals I was dragged through as a child, willingly in some instances, but the work behind the altar was these, how much more rewarding that process would have been.
That would have been amazing.
If these were altarpieces for young people figuring out what faith is.
Yeah.
Incredible.
That was a UF Orb gig, I think, was the orbital. I remember these kind of videos. It's funny, actually, raved images. That's me. I'm going to have to shout now.
The
Mic drop.
But thank you to Max, Robert, and Nigel, and for all of you for turning out tonight. How to be bothness. That's what I'm taking with me. Thank you, everyone. I believe there's more drink. Thank you, Elliot. Keep it going.
Thank you, Nigel.